You're listening to the Grassroots Church podcast. We're a Jesus-centered community in Thunder Bay, Ontario. You can learn how to participate more by going to our website at grassroots.church.
We are in a series. We're at the end of our series. This is our last message, our last teaching on this series on Theodicy. And so if you're new to Grassroots or this is your first time here, you'll be forgiven for having absolutely no clue what I'm talking about when I talk about Theodicy. But if you've been here at least once over the past 6 weeks, you're not forgiven. No, you should have an idea. Corey Hookston and I have been teaching on this topic of Theodicy, and if you're interested, you should know by now, if you should have an idea, that we are, this is a branch of theology that is concerned with, primarily, reconciling how an all-powerful, all-loving God can allow, can permit, can condone evil and suffering and pain in this world. And so throughout this series, we've been kind of taking various angles at approaching this question, and maybe some have been more interesting, some have been more compelling to you than others, which is great. But one thing that we have said all along is that on this side of eternity, at least, there is no perfect theodicy, and we've been hoping that there might be, but I think it's somewhat disappointing to myself. It's unsettling. That doesn't mean we can't talk about this problem or this topic with meaning, and I think we can offer helpful ways of dialoguing about theodicy, about reconciling this question. But it does mean that we do not have access to, behind the curtain as to what is really going on in the universe, right? That is kind of for us to figure out, maybe for us to learn on the other side of eternity, but not this side. And so the best we can do is kind of take stabs at it and seek to rationalize it with our limited human capacity. Now, as in all things, with that reality, as in all things, we are asked to trust that God looks like Jesus, first and foremost. That means God is good, God is just, and God's perfect will, his desire for this creation, because he is good, because he looks like Jesus, is for our flourishing, for goodness to permeate this good creation, and for evil to be eradicated, not just in our own lives, but in all of creation. And this is what God's perfect will is. And so one day we believe, we hope that this good and this perfect will, this will that is currently being carried out in heaven where God resides right now, will one day also be carried out on this creation. There will be a new world, a new earth, heaven and new earth, and all things will be made right. And in the meantime, we have to deal with a life that is a mixture of good and bad, right? Of joy and sorrow, of beauty and ashes. And as followers of Jesus, we are asked to partner with this God who is reconciling all things to bring about that redemption, to bring about that reconciliation in this world. And so that's really the sum of it at the end of the day. That's really what it's all about. That's where I think we are led to, at the end of our theodicies, at the end of all of our great thinking on this topic, at the end of the day, we have to settle with, and it's not really settling, it's beautiful, but we get to partner with the God of the universe in bringing healing into this world, and that's pretty cool. So this morning, as we wrap up this series, I would like us to dive one more time into suffering. Yay. Okay, great. And everyone's excited about that. I will say, next week, Michael Paul is here. Rich already mentioned that. I'm excited to hear from him. He's a really smart dude, New Testament scholar, and just, I think we'll be blessed to receive from him what he has to say. So I'm looking forward to him. I've been following him the past couple of years through his blog and through his online presence, and very much aligned with, I think, our communities, like the ethos of this community and what many of us are kind of going through in our faith. He's also gone through that in his own faith. And so, I encourage you to come check out the message next Sunday as he brings to that. And I'm looking forward to connect with him. I haven't connected with him in 20-some years, so it'll be good to see. But today, we're going to talk about suffering. And we're going to find out how do we redeem it. So if I were to walk out on the streets of Thunder Bay today, walk up to a stranger, and I were to say, can you tell me what the meaning of life is? What's the purpose of life? Just anyone randomly on the street. There is a 95% chance that they would respond with, to be what? To be happy. Yeah. The fact that everyone knows that in this room confirms what I thought. How many agree that this is kind of the perception of our world, right? Yeah. Or you ask a parent, what do you want your child to be when they grow up? They'll provide, something very noble sounding, like, honestly, I don't really care what they do. I just want them to be happy. Yeah. And I think, that's okay. We live in a society here in the West in particular, and I dare say most of us have bought into this as well, at least myself, I can say that if I'm honest, in which we believe the point of life is merely to be happy. Like all of our work, all the education, all the ambition, all of the toil and struggle is for the ultimate goal of arriving at happiness. Now, I want to be happy, and I do lots of things in my world, in my life, that tries to bring happiness into my life and tries to bring happiness into the people around me. But the problem with making happiness the sort of be-all and end-all, the telos of our existence, the end of the day, what we're shooting for, is that happiness is a feeling. And feelings are fleeting, aren't they? It's not intended to last. It's not designed to last. Happiness isn't designed to last. It can't serve as the thing that at the end of the day we are to arrive at, right? And in the absence of any larger narrative that can inform a deeper sense of purpose, we have settled with the pursuit of a feeling as a society, especially here in the West. So we live to chase a fleeting feeling. So what does that have to do with pain and suffering? Well, it is this. When the point of our existence is to be happy, then anything that disrupts happiness, such as pain and suffering, right, is simply seen as an inconvenient hurdle that must be overcome or avoided at all cost as we continue in our march toward achieving happiness. This alters how the Bible perceives pain and suffering and its role. It is reduced to pain and suffering becoming an entirely negative force in our lives and in this world. But what if that's not true? What if suffering, what if pain actually has a purpose? And I think the authors of Scripture would suggest that they absolutely do. There are three, I'm just going to share three pillars of the New Testament, three kind of main voices of the New Testament who like to challenge this understanding of pain and suffering as an entirely negative force. The first one is Paul. This is in Romans 5. This is what he says. Not only so, but we also glory in our sufferings because we know that suffering produces perseverance. Perseverance leads to character, and character leads to hope. And hope does not put us to shame because God's love has been poured out into our hearts through the Holy Spirit. Jesus' brother James writes in chapter 1, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials, whenever you endure suffering of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces, again, perseverance. And you need to let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything." And finally, Peter, he adds his voice. He says, "Dear friends, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal that has come on you to test you, but rejoice inasmuch as you participate in the sufferings of Christ, so that you may be overjoyed when his glory is revealed. And then, of course, Jesus himself sets the stage with, all of this talk of suffering. He never promises a life free of suffering. In fact, he said that following him would absolutely incur suffering. Think about that being a follower of Jesus means you will undergo suffering. But he also promises that suffering for his sake will never be meaningless, that this is the path to life, to true life. This is the mark of discipleship. This is the seed of joy for followers of Jesus. Suffering is. In fact, it is the way of the cross, and you and I, as his followers, are invited to follow the way of the cross, to enter into suffering. So let me just pause, because all along in this series, I have to confess here that I've been looking at pain and suffering through the lens of the world that sort of says happiness is the be-all and end-all, and thus suffering must be categorically bad. And so, we've sought to explain away pain and suffering with a loving God. But I'm beginning to see, and I'm a bit of a slow learner, so I apologize. You probably picked up on this already. But I'm beginning to see that happiness isn't the goal of life, and pain and suffering can actually serve as a force for good. How many of you have found this in your life? Okay, 7 of you have. The rest of this service will be my attempt to convince you that this is true. But when we accept this premise, that suffering is actually there for us, that sort of undermines our entire theodicy. Not an entire theodicy. I mean, again, there's no perfect theodicy, and we still have to reconcile with the presence of evil, and we've talked about that to some degree, but it definitely makes developing a theodicy, it changes the angle in which we approach it. Because what if suffering and pain are not always bad things? What if a good God, a God who loves us, permits suffering and pain, permits its presence in our lives for our flourishing, and for creation's flourishing? And so that then leads to the question, if we are not to vainly pursue happiness as our goal, what then is the meaning of life? If it's not to be happy, what is it? What is the pursuit of meaning? Well, remember Viktor Frankl? I've talked about him a number of times. If you've been coming to Grassroots for a while, I'm sure I've talked to him about Viktor Frankl a few times. He wrote a book in the 40s called Man's Search for Meaning. And we have this book in our library. And so if you haven't read it, it's a short book. I encourage you to read it. In fact, we also have Man's Search for Meaning, the youth edition. So if you're a young person and you're looking for some summer reading, I highly recommend this book. Feel free to chat with me after, and we can arrange a way for you to get your hands on that book. Anyway, Frankl was an Austrian psychologist. He was a neurologist who survived the death camps of World War II. He endured incredible suffering. In fact, his entire family was killed in the concentration camps. But he made some pretty astute observations while enduring all of that suffering. And one of the things he said, the sort of the premise of everything that he stood for, was that he observed that those around him in the concentration camps, those around him who were able to survive, who endured, it was not the strongest or not the most the healthiest necessarily. It was those who found, listen to this, it was those who found meaning in their suffering. It was those who found meaning in their suffering. And out of that came this entire therapy that has been used by millions of people called logos therapy, which literally means meaning therapy. But this is what he said. He quotes Friedrich Nietzsche. If you know anything about Nietzsche, this is wild, but this is what he says. Those who have a why to live, if you can find reason for your suffering, your hardship, your pain, you can deal with almost any how. And here's what's interesting. Listen to what he says about happiness, just as an aside, perhaps. He says that to the European, Again, this is 1940s. But to the European, it is characteristic of the American culture, of Western culture, that again and again one is commanded and ordered really to be happy. But happiness cannot be pursued. It must ensue. One must have reason to be happy. Once the reason is found, however, one becomes happy automatically. As we see, a human being is not one in pursuit of happiness, but rather in search of a reason to become happy. Maybe that's a little bit convoluted there, but Frankel's not rejecting happiness. In fact, happiness is the reward that comes only after you have a reason, a purpose, meaning for pursuing happiness. But he suggests that when we pursue meaning, happiness comes as sort of a byproduct. Cameron, our son, chose our family movie this last week. We don't do family movies a lot. That sounds like we're really like this family that like every Friday we watch a family movie. We don't. But this Friday we watched a family movie and it was his choice. And it was called Hector and the Search for Happiness. How many people have seen this movie? Anyone? It's available on Prime, if you have Prime. It came out in 2014. You have to get the Stars subscription, which is 99 cents. You can get that and then just cancel it right away. And then you have Stars for a month. I'm not promoting Stars. It's not an endorsement. I'm just saying that's how you can get this movie for $1. And so anyway, go rent it. It's a really good movie. Anyway, and it's a total coincidence that we're talking about this today. I did not plan this, but Cameron wanted to watch this movie and we said, sure. It's about the psychiatrist. His name is Hector. And Hector goes around the world looking for the secret to happiness. And at one point in the movie, he goes to China and he visits a monk. And the monk has lived a hard life. As a monk, he's lived a tough, troubling life within the parameters of China. That's something par for the course there. And he lives up in this mountain. And there's this conversation that stood out to me. Hector asks the monk, he says, I don't understand how you can be so happy. You've lost family members. You've been imprisoned. You've been through so much. And the monk looks at him and responds, it's because I've been through so much. Right? It's this it's the hardships of life that have produced in me this happiness. And so if we aim for happiness, we'll end up missing it. But if we aim for meaning, for a deeper purpose, something of substance, something bigger than ourselves, then I think what they're saying and what the scriptures seem to suggest is that happiness becomes a byproduct. We get that on the side. We don't pursue it for the happiness goal, but happiness comes in the end. And so as we looked at these passages of scripture that we just read, I feel they're also telling us that this is exactly the role that suffering is intended to play in our lives. Not only is meaning something we can carry into suffering, but it's also something that can be found within suffering. It's not just that we, endure pain for some future reward. All of our toil and so forth is for that. It's that suffering can actually form us in the here and now. And I think this is what Paul and James and Peter and Jesus are all pointing to when they talk about suffering producing perseverance, which produces character, which produces hope. It produces joy. And that's what Jesus meant when he said that losing your life in him, when you live in a way that follows Jesus, you will suffer. And in doing that suffering, you will come out on the other side with joy and you will find your life. That's what he's referring to. It's such a counterintuitive approach, and it's totally opposite of what our culture says we need to pursue. Pursue happiness, pursue happiness. Actually, when you do that, you miss out on the gift of pain and suffering. That's what's going on here. So let's talk more directly then. How does suffering produce meaning? If meaning is such a big deal, if we're supposed to pursue that, how does suffering serve as a catalyst, as a tool to that end? Because if we're going to move beyond sort of the Western narrative of chasing happiness, we need something stronger, something rooted. And I think this is where the Christian narrative, the story of the biblical story of redemption, this is where it offers us something that the rest of the world does not offer us, and it can't. Not just an explanation for suffering, but actually a way to redeem our suffering. But first, we need to answer another question. What is the purpose of life? Who knew we would get so philosophical this morning? What is the purpose of life? And if you're a follower of Jesus, it's actually not that hard of a question. We talk about these big ideas a lot here at Grassroots. There's lots of ways you can come at this question. I think they're all right. You could say to partner with God in the reconciliation of all things. Yep, that's great. That's absolutely perfect. That is a Grassroots answer to this question. It is a N.T. Wright answer to this question. It is a biblical answer to this question. Absolutely. We reconcile all things in partnership with God. We talked about that already. We could say, just as Jesus said, the point is to love God and to love others. Go out and do that, and you would be 100% correct. You could also say to be formed into the likeness of Christ, that we spend our days shaping, honing, developing our character and the way that we live so that it reflects and resembles the person of Jesus. And you would be right. And all three of these reflect the Christian's vision and purpose in life. They're really different ways of saying the same thing. Our lives are meant to reflect, to participate in, and to point to the person of Jesus. And each of these purposes are full of meaning. They connect us to something bigger than ourselves. They are something outside of our own comfort and well-being. Beyond that, deeper than that, we're called to follow and pursue that. So that's the case. And if you've been following Jesus for more than a single day, you will know that the life of following Jesus, sincerely, authentically following the person of Jesus, seeking to live in this way with this meaning, is difficult. It's not easy, right? It requires sacrifice. It costs something of you. It involves hardship. It involves self-denial. It leads to suffering. Following Jesus requires suffering. What a beautiful marketing approach, Jesus. You really messed that one up, right? Following Jesus invites suffering. And all the stuff that Jesus would be required, following Jesus would be required, should we wish to follow him. All of that is an invitation to join him in his sufferings. Now, obviously, we don't pursue those things in order to arrive at happiness. That's not why we do it. We do it because we believe it's true, right? We believe following Jesus is true. It's good. It's beautiful. It leads to flourishing. It leads to life, regardless of whether happiness shows up or not. And this, I think, is where the Christian story subverts the Western script on purpose and meaning. Because if the world tells us suffering is only ever a setback, it's an obstacle, right? A hurdle to overcome, then the way of Jesus insists, listen to this, it's not a setback, it's a setup. Suffering, pain, suffering, hardship, turmoil, tragedy even, is a setup for our growth, for our transformation, and ultimately for our communion with God and one another. Not pain for pain's sake, but pain that forms something deeper in us as his followers. A requirement to follow him. As Paul says, pain is there it's something we can glory in. Or as James says, we can take joy in pain. That is so counterintuitive. I don't know about you, but every time I endure hardship and struggle, the last thing I want to do is take joy in it. But this is exactly what Paul, Peter, and all the writers of Scripture are telling us to do. And this is why. Because in that, we find meaning. So, how does this work out? Well, getting back to this question, how does suffering lead to deeper meaning in our lives? And I want to close this morning by looking at 5 general ways that suffering invites an opportunity for meaning in our lives. Ready? How does suffering serve as a catalyst to bring about meaning in our lives? Let's reorient our perception on suffering. Instead of dismissing it as bad all the time, negative force, what if we saw it as something that could be good, a good force. So the first thing is this: suffering invites us to discover what we're made of. Oftentimes in Scripture, suffering comes, it's defined, it's used this metaphor of a test. Not a test like you would take in school, say, like, you take a test on math and you pass or you fail. But John Mark Comer, who I referenced last week, and I've used him a fair bit in the series, and that's fine. He's got lots of good stuff to say, but he says it's more like a metallurgist test. A metallurgist. It's a big word. And in fact, that's kind of what the Scriptures use as this metaphor in its description of suffering. Listen to this. Job says, "He knows the way that I take. When he has tested me, I shall come forth as gold." Right? Or Isaiah, "See, I have refined you, though not as silver. I have tested you in the furnace of affliction." Zechariah says, "This third I will put into the fire. I will refine them like silver and test them like gold." And on. This metaphor is used throughout Scripture. So this idea that if you heat up this raw material, like really, really, really hot, what happens is all the impurities, all the dross, is that the word? All the dross falls away. And what you're left with is what's of value: the gold, the silver, the pure mineral that is all that remains. And so most of us, I think maybe even all of us, we tend to wear various masks in public, personas that we project to the world around us. There's all sorts of reasons we do this. But we have such a tendency to do this, I think, that it is possible that we ourselves get duped into who we really are. Who is at our core? Who are we truthfully? And so what suffering does, what the hardships of life do, is that it serves as this fire that says, what are you really made of inside? Who are you actually? This is an invitation. It's like a mirror to review, to look at who we are at our core. Who is the person that God has made us to be? With all the masks taken off, all the personas we project removed, who remains there? That's a gift of suffering, right? When you suffer, and especially if you are suffering from like acute hardships, like whether it's mental health, whether it's a job loss, the loss of someone in your life, a diagnosis, whatever kinds of suffering we all go through, those kind of sufferings leave us with not enough emotional capacity to deal with any of the images we project. All we have left is who we are. The charade drops, and we reveal to the world and to ourselves what we're really made of. Comer uses this analogy. He says it's like a sponge. After you use a sponge and all the gross dishwater, you hold the sponge up and it looks fine. But as you squeeze it out, all of the gross, icky, dirty water falls out, and all you're left with is this sponge. So who is that person? Suffering is an invitation to reveal who that person is. And that leads us to the second thing. Oops. Oh, no, there we go. Doop. Sorry. Oh, there is a number 2. Well, here we go. Stephen, you screwed it up. That's okay. Suffering invites us to... Oh man, that's even wrong. Ha! I got the wrong one on there. No, it's not meant to do that. Boy, oh boy. This is why you review your slides after, all right? Kids, listen to that instruction. Here's what I have. Just pretend it's there. Suffering invites us into transformation. And I didn't mean to derail that, sorry. But it's only once we know what we are made of, right? What our true nature, our true character is, that we are able to change. In fact, one of my mantras in life, and this has been born out of my own experience, I think it's true. I think the Scriptures seem to suggest this too. But I have found this to be very true in my life, and so I tell it to everyone. My mantra is that we can only grow. The only way we can truly transform is through tribulation and trial. Everything else becomes an act. But once you go through trials and tribulation, once you suffer, once you endure pain, then you are open to being transformed. Now, maybe it's possible that God can shape our character. I'm sure it is. God can probably shape our character in other ways. And maybe it's morbid to think the only way we can change is to go through suffering. But this has been my experience, at least. So it's kind of true, if nothing else. But it's through the overcoming the resistances of life, right? The pushbacks of the world, the hardship, the conflicts that we all endure. It's going through that. It's going through the fire, the refining fire, and coming out on the other side that we are changed. Pain confronts us with our limitations and pulls us into, believe this, more Jesus-likeness if we allow it. This is true in all sorts of ways, but one that is readily apparent in my mind is, and again, I can only speak to my own suffering here, and I'm incredibly fortunate that my suffering, I've heard many of your stories and the ordeals in life that you go through and still struggle with, and so I don't mean to, I'm not trying to one-up anyone. We all suffer in our own way, but one way that I have grown is through empathy. I have found that suffering has led me to greater empathy. And I can actually pinpoint in my life when that began. And I've shared this story many times, so I won't belabor this at all. But years ago, I lost my brother. I was 18 years old, and he was 24 years old. And so that was, a really rough time in my life. But I remember, as an 18-year-old, he had a brain aneurysm, by the way. And as an 18-year-old kid, I was an 18-year-old kid. Like we all are. Selfish. I thought the world revolved around me. I thought I had all the answers. All that stuff, right? And something about standing by my brother's bedside, something about watching my family grieve as their son, as their brother, as their loved one say goodbye, something caused me to grow up in a real hurry. I was hoping I wouldn't choke up with this one. Anyway, all sorts of ways I grew up very quickly. And it was one of the things that was unexpected in how I grew up was growing in empathy. Empathy for the struggle of those around me, those who also endured suffering. And it didn't have to be like, oh, they also, lost a brother or lost a loved one. It didn't have to be. It was just like all suffering. Suddenly, I had capacity to hold, not suddenly, it took time, but I had capacity to hold their suffering. And that only came through having undergone suffering myself. How many people have found that to be true? Yeah. We grow in empathy. We grow in character. We are open to being transformed when we go through suffering ourselves, if we allow it. If we allow it. And I didn't see it as an 18-year-old kid, but I look back and I'm like, oh man, that's where I started to change. That's when my character started to form in this way. Now, there are lots of other ways, and we don't need to talk about those things, that my character still needs growth in. I know. But one area that I feel like I excel in is in empathy, is being able to feel the pain of others. And I think that's just like evidence of what suffering can do, the good that suffering can bring. So that leads to 3. Suffering invites us to connect with others. And so when we suffer, we realize that we are not alone. Henry Now, in his book, The Wounded Healer, he writes this: compassion, which means literally to suffer with, is the way to the truth that we are most ourselves, not when we differ from others, but when we are the same. And so as Jesus followers, our calling isn't just to feel sorry for one another in the pain and the struggle and the hardships of life, but it's actually, listen to this, it's actually to enter into that struggle with one another. That's your calling. It's not to look at it from a distance, but it's actually to enter into it with them. And I know you know this and maybe experienced it, but there are 4 simple words that just that make this possible. And those 4 words are this: I've been there too, right? Or I know your pain. There's 4 other words. I know your pain. That when that is spoken from the heart and is true, it brings us together. It brings us together. It disarms the other. It opens up the conversation. It connects us with one another. And I can't tell you over just the last few years how many times I've gone to coffee with many of you and people beyond our community here who have shared their pain, and I have found parallels in that pain. And I said, man, me too. I've been there. I know what that's like, and genuinely know what that's like. How in doing that, the tone of the conversation completely changed. Guards went down, and suddenly we are connecting. How many people have felt that in their life? Yeah. See, as we do that, and that's, again, part of the gift of suffering and pain. It is forming pathways to each other. Suffering and pain allows us to find each other, right? And I better add this caveat, and I know I'm already well over time. Sorry, Scott. I feel like Scott might care. I don't know. But I'm going to add this caveat because I think it's important. Then I'll like rush through the last two. Okay, promise. I'm going to offer this as a warning that this is important. When we say, I've been there too, it has to be true, doesn't it? It can't just be like, I don't know what else to say in this awkward moment, so I'm going to say, yeah, I know what you mean. I've been there. It can't be that. It's disingenuous. It's deceptive. And it will fall short. It will fall flat. And it will do the opposite of building connection and community. So when you go through pain, the only way to connect with other people in this way is to have gone through suffering yourself, is to have endured suffering and pain yourself. Years ago, we met, we had friends who had lost a son to whatever, and it was just terrific grief, right? Just brutal grief in their life. And months after they lost this son, there was a well-meaning friend who was deeply uninformed, but well-meaning, who came to visit them, and her son was off to university for the first time. And this friend said to this grieving mother, I finally know what you are feeling. Did she? No. She had no idea. You could call your son at university. You can connect with them anytime you want. This woman could never do that again. So there was this I won't even tell you it wasn't a huge fallout. That's too dramatic. But it was just like this complete disconnect with this person. And, I think years later she apologized and recognized sort of the misstep in that comment. But my point is, in order to build connection, to draw into one another, we can't go around the suffering. We can't just arrive on the other side and be like, oh yeah, it probably was bad. We have to go through it ourselves. This is the gift of suffering. Fourth, suffering invites us to align with Jesus. So for Christians, for all of us, meaning isn't just some philosophical pursuit, right? We just esoterically look for meaning or whatever. It's deeply personal. It's not about chasing a sense of significance out in the ether. It's about becoming like Jesus. Very specifically, Jesus followers are called to become like Jesus. And that means having union with him, not just in what he taught, but in the suffering he endured. Paul puts it powerfully in Philippians. He says, I want to know Christ. Yes, to know the power of his resurrection. Absolutely. That's a glorious, victorious thing. Beautiful. That's what I want to know him for. But also the fellowship of sharing in his sufferings. And that line has always stopped me, because it's not just about knowing Jesus and the good, victorious, mountaintop experiences, but in the dark and painful ones as well, to suffer with him, to share in what he carried. Now, we don't go looking for suffering. We're not masochists, right? We don't glorify it. But when suffering comes, as it is inevitable to do, when we choose the way of love, the way of Jesus, when we choose to carry the burdens of one another, when we choose to stand up for what's right, suffering will come. When that happens, our lives begin to echo, to parallel Jesus' life in his sufferings. Okay, that's all I'll say about that. And then finally, suffering redirects our hope. It is an invitation to reorientate our hope. And I'm just going to touch on this because of time. But think about if you had a life of comfort and bliss and there's no hardships and there's no struggle, would you ever pine for something more? No. You'd be content where you're at. If I'm lying on the beach in Mexico and I've got a pina colada in my hand, I'm not wishing for something else. I want this moment right here. It's when I am standing in minus 30 in the darkness of January that I am longing for something more. I'm longing for, the warm beaches and the salty air and all of that. And I think this is the nature of suffering. Whereas comfort tempts us to put our hope in temporary things, suffering invites us to sort of break the illusion and to anchor our hope in something better to come. And for Jesus' followers, we, again, as I mentioned earlier, we look to the reconciliation of all things as our ultimate hope lived out, right? Beyond the beach and the cold drinks to this new world where everything is made right and where God's perfect will that is in heaven comes to pass here on earth as well. Paul writes in 2 Corinthians, our light and momentary troubles, the hardships, the struggle that you go through now. Oops, that's not where I wanted to go. Man, you have to go right to the end there. Sorry. But he writes this, our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory. 2 Corinthians 4:17. Any pain and suffering we face is, if nothing else, a reminder that this is not all there is. Again, it serves as a gift to point us to deeper hope, to ultimate hope. Okay, suffering invites us to deep hope. So that's 5 things that I think are good. And so let's close this series this morning. And I'm not sure really how to land this plane. So let me just say this. You can take it for what it's worth. I think, as we said throughout the series, that God gives us free choice in all things and in every sphere of our life. And that includes choosing how we respond to suffering. And suffering, as we said this morning, isn't always a negative force. Sometimes it is for our good. And I think we need to challenge ourselves to see it that way, to reorient ourselves. And it's in suffering that we can find meaning. However, because we are given the choice, it does not guarantee, God does not guarantee that we will be formed into Christ-likeness through enduring suffering. You probably know people. I know people, I've been there myself even, where I've gone through something hard. And rather than creating hope or Christ-likeness, forming me into the person of Jesus, it actually led to despair and bitterness, right? And I don't know what to say to that. I don't judge anyone for that. Like, I don't know the story you walked in. I don't know how hardship has formed you or how it hasn't formed you. I just know that this is a choice. It's an opportunity, and I believe that God provides the way to be formed into his likeness if we're willing to walk in that. And so my prayer for this community, for Grassroots Church, for all of us in this room, my prayer is that when the challenges of life come, and they will come, that we will, one, not dismiss them as a hurdle to be overcome as we chase happiness. 2, that we would not see them just as this grim reality that leads to bitterness and despair and hopelessness. But 3, that we would have an openness to be transformed and to allow suffering to serve as a crucible for forging deeper meaning, deeper character, and more Jesus-likeness.